This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. You're listening to a section of the LibriVox NaNoWriMo project, in which a number of LibriVox volunteers write and record a whole novel together in serial form during November 2006. The project is based on the idea started by the National Novel Writing Month. Chapter 11. Written and recorded by Maria Morabe. Fulvia Rossi stared out of the window as the plane took off. She heard the roar of its engine start to diminish as it shrank out of view. So Trevor was not totally hopeless after all. She'd been wrong to think it would be easy. "Miss Rossi, is it?" The man had a high-pitched voice that reminded her of children begging for sweets. "We are thoroughly sorry for this inconvenience. Were you on a business trip?" Fulvia put on her best "I'm better than you, but I'm trying to be humble for your sake" face. "Not entirely, sir. Mr. Ames and I were going to get married in Prague." Well..." The man turned bright red. "I'm sorry to have put it on hold, then. He searched for words and ended up not finding any. Another man in the uniform of airport security entered the room. "I leave you now." Perfect. He was playing right into her plan. Her fingers surreptitiously found their way to her handbag, and she clutched it as though she were nervous. She pulled out a compact and started powdering her face nonchalantly. The man just waited for her to finish. She put the compact away and looked at him. The other man was young, perhaps in his late 20s. He had close-cut blonde hair and stone-cold gray eyes. Unconsciously, she dropped her gaze. His stare made her nervous. "Well?" she asked. She folded her arms across her chest. "What am I accused of, since this obviously isn't a social call?" When the man spoke, it was with barely a hint of an Eastern European accent. "We found this in your luggage." He produced a pistol from behind him. "Would you care to explain it?" "Certainly, Mr. Tolstoy, like the author." "Indeed." Fulvia faked a coughing fit and rummaged in her handbag. "Excuse me." Mr. Tolstoy watched as she drew out a piece of paper from her bag. "What is that?" "My papers of diplomatic immunity." Not really, but she needed time. She handed the papers over with one hand, while her other hand found the handle of her handy little rod. A look of confusion crossed over the man's face. "These are not papers of immunity," he said. "This one is from a store. It says you have a penny bill." Yes. While the man was preoccupied trying to figure out what she'd given him, she hit him smartly over the back of his head. Slowly, the man collapsed to the floor. It was drama worthy of Russian literature. Smiling to herself, Fulvia walked to the door and glanced out of the room. The man with the high voice was nowhere to be seen. He had obviously assumed that a woman was not much of a challenge. Ha! Fulvia made her way out into the corridor, trying to simulate the stance of a mere tourist. The way out of the airport was simple enough as long as she stayed out of sight of the security cameras and anybody who had already seen her. She was in fresh air faster than she expected. She made a mental note to tell someone about the terrible airport security. But that would be later. Now, however, she had to find a way to get back to Trevor, the manuscript, and that annoying girl she'd seen boarding the plane, the Nevea girl. No doubt she was off to rendezvous with Mr. Ames and feed him tantalizing bits of information. Trevor woke with a jolt. What a strange dream he'd had. He should definitely not have watched the relatively new War of the Worlds movie before going to sleep. But he'd been unable to sleep so much that he'd actually resorted to watching TV. At least it had been a movie based on a novel, rather than the sort of happy-go-lucky drivel his sister would watch. Good God, if he slipped and said that in her presence, he'd never live to read another book again, much less see more book adaptations. Trevor groaned and sat up in the darkness. Parts of him still throbbed from the beating Fulvia had given him. Note to self: never hand a woman a stick, be it metal or otherwise. Throwing the bedclothes off, he stood up and went to the bathroom to tidy himself up a bit. Next door, he could hear Hazel doing the same thing. A watch beeped, and he saw that it was 6:30 in the morning. Rise and shine, thought processes. Today is a new day filled with excitement and intrigue. And pain. Ow! Trevor leapt backwards, clutching his toe. He'd walked straight into something hard. Muttering to himself, he reached for a lamp, switched it on, and found the bathroom, somehow without doing any more damage to himself. After completing his usual ablutions, he felt more like his normal self. He knocked on the door to Hazel's adjoining room. There were the sounds of movement, and then the door opened. "Morning, Trevor," Hazel said cheerily. Trevor managed to mumble in reply, "I've made some coffee." "Coffee!" Trevor felt himself gladden at the mere thought. Hazel laughed. Her laugh sounded like the tinkling of chimes in the breeze. "Sheesh, cliché, anyone?" He found his voice, finally. "Thanks, that'd be great. Mind if I come in?" "Why else would I be offering you coffee?" she said. "Of course you can." Her hotel room was nicer than his, Trevor noticed. There was nothing to stub your toe on at all. Maybe it was just that she was more organized than he was. Her clothes were neatly put away somewhere, not that he was looking for them, and her makeup was neatly set up in front of a mirror. He found himself wondering what women did with all that makeup they usually carried. Surely they didn't wear it all at once. He sat down at a small table where 2 coffee cups sat. She sat down across from him, absent-mindedly playing with her blonde hair. She took a sip of her coffee and looked at him curiously. "What's on your mind?" "What?" He hadn't realized that he'd been staring into space. For some reason, the Martians, or whatever they were from his dream, kept invading his thoughts. Not to mention the disappearing Hazel scene. "Oh, dream. I see. Don't they get on your nerves sometimes?" "Sometimes." Trevor cleared his throat. "So, do you have any plans for today?" "Not really," Hazel confessed. "You?" Trevor thought for a moment. A long one. He'd told Fulvia the papers were in Prague, and they were. The problem was that he himself was not sure where in Prague they were. All he knew was that he'd sent them to one of Tracy's old professors. Professor Andel Prozak was fluent in many languages, and as a result many ciphers and codes as well. He had been Tracy's linguistics professor. Why Tracy had been taking a linguistics course, Trevor still hadn't figured out. And in the duration of the class, Trevor had come to admire the old professor, though by no means was Professor Prozak old by most people's reckoning. Indeed, at 50 years, he was considered something of a prodigy in his field. The only problem was that Professor Prozak was often called away to different universities or institutions within the city, and quite possibly to other cities and countries as well. Well, one must start somewhere. "Trevor," Hazel tapped him gently. "A little tired, are you?" Trevor shook his head to clear his thoughts. "I was, planning to go to the National Library, if that was okay with you." The National Library would be close to Charles University, Prozak's last known location. That's an idea." Hazel stood up. "As your official tour guide, I say we leave at 7:30. It was only 7 o'clock. Trevor didn't have the urge to spend another 30 minutes in a hotel, even if he would be spending it in the company of someone rather attractive. "Why not now? Let's walk the distance." Okay. Are you ready?" "Quite," Trevor said. Ivory in pocket, all other materials accounted for. Something was nagging at the back of his head, but he put it off. As they walked, Trevor thought. The chill wind woke him up more than a meager cup of coffee could. The chinchilla rubbed against him. He squinted against the morning sun and tried to force his thoughts into coherent order. Beside him, Hazel strode briskly. Trevor found his thoughts wandering until they rested on her. "I love Google," she'd said. "It's almost as wonderful as LibriVox." It could have just been his paranoia, but hadn't she known nothing about LibriVox? He could remember her saying, "What's LibriVox?" what seemed like years ago, but he knew it was just a few days, at the most weeks. "Trevor, you're awfully quiet." Am I?" Trevor saw the university up ahead. He recognized it from Tracy's postcards when she'd gone abroad. "There's the university. The library ought to be around here somewhere." Hazel pointed. "It's over there. Now, why are you so quiet?" Trevor ignored her until they were inside the library. He pulled her into a secluded alcove. By now, the chinchilla was running crazily in circles. He could go no longer without answering her. For some reason, he found it hard to think she was merely a tour guide. "Who are you, really?" Hazel looked at him, confused. "What do you mean? You know too much to be just a tour guide." "Couldn't I be a smart tour guide?" Trevor rolled his eyes. You said you knew nothing about LibriVox, and then you said Google was almost as wonderful as LibriVox. How would you know that? Aren't you reading into my words a bit much? That's my job. Or as much of a job as I do have. Trevor looked at her intently. His hand was inches from hers. Right. She turned away. Trevor was treated with a wonderful profile view, but he was much too preoccupied to pay attention. You found me out, then? She turned around. Trevor was struck by the change in her appearance. She was still beautiful, but it wasn't as evident. She's more forgettable, which, no doubt, was the reason he hadn't recognized her. All the personality had left her. She was a mere puppet now. Her eyes were blank, her made-up face set in some semblance of a smile. When she spoke, her voice was devoid of natural expression, and filled instead with a false cheeriness. So, did you bring your chinchilla with you, Mr. Ames? End of Chapter 11. Recorded on November 12, 2006.